Layer 3. Nixon's madman theory. The madman theory was a concept proposed by Richard Nixon during his tenure. The idea was to make the foreign adversaries of the U.S. believe that Nixon was an unhinged, irrational figure, which in theory would deter them from making potentially hostile moves that would provoke Nixon to, for example, use a nuclear strike. Nixon said, "Call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached a point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip the word to them that, for God's sakes, Nixon is obsessed with communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry, and he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace." In October 1969, Nixon ordered his bombers armed with nukes flown near the Soviet border. Nixon's escalation into Cambodia after the Tet Offensive was a supposed signal to the NVA that they should not escalate further. Trump for using the madman.
You told me in a previous interview that you told the leader of the Taliban, before you ever talked about any withdrawal, any planned withdrawal, you said to me that in no uncertain terms, you would obliterate him if he dared not to follow every dotted I, cross T, comma, period.
Abdul, I did. Had a number of conversations.
Didn't you at one point tell him, I know exactly where you are, and give him the exact coordinates where he was?
No, I sent him a picture of his house. He said, but
where
why?
He was at the time.
He said, but why do you send me a picture of my house? I said, you have to figure that one out. But I said,
Détente. The other side of the Nixon policy, the term détente, means an easing of hostilities between two entities. This is referring to U.S. foreign policy under Nixon. Though he wanted to be perceived as a madman anti-communist fanatic, he also wanted to be viewed as reasonable and would still sit down and make a deal. During this, Nixon took a trip to communist China to establish relations, to make the Soviets and North Vietnamese isolated. This would give the Soviets an incentive to meet and create the SALT I Treaty, which limited the nuclear weapon capabilities between both states. Evil Empire speech. President Reagan was elected after Republicans perceived weakness of President Carter. The Americans seemed on the back foot as they had withdrawn from Vietnam and seeked for an easing of hostilities. But many saw that the communist countries were also in decline. Vietnam had fought China and Cambodia. China and the Soviets were no longer friends, so Reagan wished to ramp up arms spending as it was believed the Soviet economy couldn't handle it, and they would seek to the negotiating table. Reagan made his case to the American people on multiple occasions, echoing a view shared by many that the U.S. was an active good in the world in fighting against the Soviet Union in his famous Star Wars program. As part of Reagan's arms race was the Star Wars program, more known as the Space Defense Initiative. It was a scientific and defense program which studied the feasibility and practicality of a potential defense system which would protect the U.S. from a nuclear attack. Imagine the Israeli Iron Dome system put across the entire U.S. and works against nuclear missiles. Since mutually assured destruction was considered the inevitable outcome of the nuclear war, Reagan believed the suicide pact could be averted to avoid global destruction, and even considered sharing the technology with the Soviets. Many were critical of the program for being too expensive and technologically impossible, which drew many to conclude that the entire program was a bluff to the Soviet Union that America could afford and have the scientific capabilities to producing such a program, which would make America be viewed as a superior world power.
Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In Reagan's visit to Berlin in 1987, he gave arguably the most famous line of it, as the Soviet Union had been at war in Afghanistan for 8 years, and the arms race had left the Soviet Union behind technologically, but their economy couldn't keep up. 1960 U-2 incident. May 1st, 1960, a U-2 spy plane took off from Pakistan to do reconnaissance over the USSR until an air missile shot it down, which the Soviet captured the pilot, Captain Francis Gary Powers. The Soviets also shot down their own fighter pilot pursuing Powers. He was also killed by the U.S. claimed it was a NASA weather analysis exercise until the Soviet Union showed the aerial photography of the Soviet military bases acquired by the U-2. Though President Eisenhower had been privately against the U.S. sending reconnaissance over Soviet airspace, in public he defended the action. This all happened weeks before the 1960 Paris summit that both Eisenhower and Khrushchev would attend, and many believed this failure could soil the meeting. Though in my opinion, it seems like Khrushchev didn't want to ruin the meeting, so he just used it as more bluster. JFK would use this against Richard Nixon in the election later that Francis Gary Powers would be released in a prisoner exchange 2 years later. Ironically, he would die in a helicopter crash in 1977. Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable was a secret plan made in 1945 by the British military leadership in case of a possible war with the Soviet Union. One part of the plan was to launch a surprise attack on the Soviets under the casus belli of the security of a free Poland. The plan assumed that the US would be in full support of the British military, but this was contradicted by FDR's intentions for the US to withdraw from Europe. The plan assumed the Soviets would win a short-term war on the battlefield. Even the British public may not have been behind the war, as everyone was war fatigued by May 1945, and the British media had pushed so much pro-Soviet propaganda throughout the war that may have led to the Labour Party winning the election in July 1945. Laika. Laika was a Soviet stray dog who was on the Sputnik 2, a spacecraft launched in November 1957, who became the first animal in orbit. Laika died from overheating during the flight and had put additional pressure on the Eisenhower administration that JFK in the 1960 election said it was not in the US interest to be viewed as technologically inferior to the USSR. It was the fear that the Soviets had missile strike capabilities that could endanger the US heartland. Laika was actually in space for 5 months until Sputnik 2 re-entered and burned up in the atmosphere. The spacecraft orbited the Earth over 2,000 times. Sergei Bolshakov was a Soviet GRU spy in the inner circle of the Kennedy administration who worked as a liaison between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. Bolshakov was vital in setting up the Vienna Summit of 1961, as well as diffusing the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, as he allowed for direct communication between the two leaders. He also set up the Hotline, which was a direct telephone system between Washington and Moscow. SR-71. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a manned American spy plane developed in 1964, which had over 3,000 missions. It was used to perform much reconnaissance over North Vietnam, and one was even used to search for traces of hijacker D.B. Cooper in 1971. No SR-71s were shot down in its entire history. They were retired in the 90s. Shoe-banging incident. During a UN meeting in October 1960 was when a blustering Nikita Khrushchev reportedly got so angry that he banged his shoe on the podium as he was giving a speech in response to a Filipino representative that had criticized the Soviets' policy toward Eastern Europe. Though this incident hasn't been proven, it was reported in American newspapers, including this picture from the Associated Press. There's a shoe at an end to Khrushchev, who is banging on the table with his fist. Operation Paperclip. At the end of World War II, the US had an intelligence program, of which Operation Paperclip was a part of, whose goal was to collect as much Nazi science, research, and tech, including the brightest scientific minds of the Nazi state, which resulted in over 1,600 Nazis working for the US bureaucracy. The US leadership didn't want this tech to fall into the communist hands, and to also have a leg up that they as well wanted to investigate whether Goebbels' propaganda of wonder weapons had any truth. Also, many individuals in the US scientific community had an interest for tech that would get them promoted, more funding, more fame, and be the genius of the German innovation, even if many of the scientific created weapons were used against belligerent nations and internal undesirables. All the moon missions would be directed by Wernher von Braun, who helped engineer the rocket. Von Braun said, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet, Earth." The Soviets had also acquired many German scientists for their programs. The Soviet Soyuz rocket was based off of the original German plan for V-2 rocket technology. Operation Mongoose. After the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, though it was mainly planned by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was for the CIA to use covert tactics, soft and hard power, including terrorist attacks, to destabilize the Castro regime in Cuba. This is where we get the hundreds of assassination attempts on Castro's life, like exploding cigars and poisonous seashells. It also included putting thallium salts in his shoes to make his beard fall out to make him appear weaker. They allegedly tried to hire mob boss Sam Giancana to assassinate Castro, which to the JFK assassination you may be familiar with. The operation was headed by Major General Edward Lansdale, the same guy who used a fake vampire attack to overthrow the Filipino government. It is known that there were attacks on oil refineries, sugar mills, mines, etc. to overthrow the Castro, led to the defense bureaucracy eventually proposing to President Kennedy Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods was drafted in 1962 by individuals in the CIA and Defense Department, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman L. Lemitzer, which proposed staging a false flag attempt on the U.S. in order to justify military intervention in Cuba. These false flags included bombing civilian targets like schools within the U.S. near Florida and Washington, D.C., as well as attacks on the U.S. base in Guantanamo Bay. RFK even proposed to blow up the U.S. Embassy in the Dominican Republic and put all the blame on Castro. President Kennedy vetoed the proposal. General Lemitzer would not be reappointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the next year. We will bury you. In November 1956, Khrushchev was speaking to ambassadors from 13 Western nations when he said, "You capitalist states, it doesn't depend on you whether or not we exist. If you don't like us, don't accept our invitations, and don't invite us to come to see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." Though what could be taken as a threat, many, including Khrushchev in his memoirs, has said that this was wildly misproportioned, and that he actually indicated that the communists will bury you as if they were there for your funeral, not to put you to death itself. Communists like Khrushchev believed that capitalism would have an inevitable death, and that communists would be there to witness it. Broken arrow incidents. Broken arrows refer to the accidental loss of a nuclear weapon. The U.S. is thought to have made over 70,000 nuclear weapons since 1945, with at least 32 being lost. In 1968, 4 nukes were lost over northern Greenland. Many attempts. Russia has lost hundreds of nuclear weapons. Many feared during the collapse of the Soviet Union, the nukes would end up in random groups' hands and possibly be on the black market. It seems like this didn't happen though. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan all gave their nukes to Russia in 1990s. Lost cosmonauts. 4 cosmonauts are known to have died during space travel, including the first man, Vladimir Komarov, who burned up in the atmosphere as his capsule parachute didn't deploy. The other 3 were the Soyuz 11 crew, who died as a result of depressurization. We have concluded that many more have died during the Soviet space program, to cover up failures during the space race. The Soviet had sent the first female in space in 1963, though some Italian brothers who would listen to the spaceflight dialogue with their communications radio in 1991 said they heard a female cosmonaut talking to ground control about heating up in a burning capsule upon re-entry. There has never been any acknowledgement that this woman existed. How many men have died in the space race? Korean Airlines Flight 007. Korean Flight 007 was a flight from New York to Seoul via Anchorage that was shot down near the Sea of Japan for passing through Soviet airspace, killing 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. This was another huge escalation in tension, which arguably was one of the most tense moments of the Cold War, after the United States and Soviet Union had moved nuclear weapons in their favored European countries. The hardliners of Reagan and Andropov taking over and the resumption of the arms race contributed to this as well. There was a lesser-known shoot-down in 1978 over the Norwegian Sea of Korean Airlines Flight 902 for violating Soviet airspace, resulting in 2 deaths.